before we get started for this afternoon session. So you got about 2 more minutes. Thank you. We have 1 minute. Please start getting back to your positions. Thank you, everyone. So we get this afternoon session started, please. This afternoon session will be the introduction for our speaker, Mark Steigerwald. Mark?
Thank you, Don. I am thrilled to be able to introduce you all to Rob Dyson. So Rob has had a long association with Watkins International as well as the Research Center. Excuse me. A couple of highlights of Rob's career. He received his license, his competition license in 1974. 1981, he won the SCCA GT2 National Championship. 1982, Rob participated in his first professional race, IMSA GTO and SCCA Trans Am. And in 1983, Dyson Racing was formed. 19 championships, 72 victories, and two Rolex 24 victories to date. Rob himself raced 21 seasons, 92 races, and 18 podium finishes in that time span. Rob is passionate about history, currently serves as chairman of the board of the International Motor Speedway Museum, where he oversees the museum's renovation, which is currently in the throes now towards an $89 million campaign. Last but not least, in 2011, Rob saw to it that the Research Center received a donation of the National Speed Sport News Archives, which is a collection that we use almost daily at the Research Center. So without further ado, let me introduce you to Rob Dyson.
Thanks. Well, hi, everybody. Thank you, Mark. I appreciate the introduction. One of the things that when I was asked to speak about my personal experiences at Watkins Glen, it's hard not to be a little bit emotional about it. You know, it really comes in 4 stages. My first stage here was as a race fan. I think that's the way everybody starts, somewhere or another. You start as a race fan. You know, the first time I came up here, I drove up here from Millbrook, New York in 1963, in the summer for sports car racing. And every year, it was an odd year if I didn't come up here at least twice. It was summer at Watkins Glen. Summer at Watkins Glen was a norm of some sort of racing, sometimes twice. Can-Am, sports cars, any kind of event that was taking place in the summer. Or alternatively, either freezing or getting sunburned in October for the F1 race. Many of you probably attended the F1 races. My first one was in 1965. And the one thing that so disturbed me was it took an awful lot of effort to get into the pits. And fortunately, if you looked at the color coding of the pit passes in those days and brought one of those packets of multicolored that you get in the school supply store, multicolored, you get the rest of the idea. Just to show you how important Watkins Glen and being here and coming to events at Watkins Glen as a race fan, my wife and I were married on August 28th, 1971. In October of 1971, she joined me up here. Fortunately, we were able to get passes, and it didn't rain that year. But she really enjoyed it. But I'll talk about her in a few minutes. So here you go. It started as being a race fan. When I was in graduate school at Cornell starting in 1972, I came over here, cut classes to come over here for the US Grand Prix because it was so close by. I mean, Ithaca is what, about 45 minutes, an hour away, right? I came over the hill, came here when they were unloading the trucks. I said, I'll get here on Sunday or Monday just to see what's going on. I helped them unload the trucks. So I got a pass that enabled me to come, and I came every single day, including race day. But with the pass, I was able to get around. That was in 72 and 73. I spent the entire week here. And that was in the days when the cars were brought in on a kind of a car hauler. And the crews were smaller, and they rolled the cars into the Kendall Center. And it was fairly primitive, but it was Formula One. And it was amazing when you think back on it, how it's all evolved. Now you have crews, minimal crews, probably, I would be surprised if they don't have 200 people at the race per car. In addition to that, I will also admit that I would come over here in my BMW during graduate school, periodically, and drive this racetrack. There were very few barriers, and frankly, there was a county road that went right through the racetrack, right? Right, guys? Remember? You know, I'll even show it to you if you wanted me to show you. But anyway, there was a track. You could come up to the track, get in, and I wouldn't drive for high speeds, but I would drive the racetrack for maybe half an hour, just driving down into the boot, coming up out of the boot, driving around one of the barricades that were minimal, not even covering the whole width of the racetrack. Excuse me. Now, I don't want to pull a Rudy Giuliani thing talking to my wife, but let me find out how my son is doing at COTA, would you please? I'm speaking. You want to tell me how you're doing? All right. Just have a great conversation. We'll talk after. As a longtime car owner, that sounds ominous to me. Anyway, so you have to understand that it was Rob Dyson, the race fan, that first got acquainted with this wonderful facility at a very early age. This was when the pits, before the boot was built, before the pits were built, before even the access or anything remotely approaching a media center was ever built. Then we go to stage 2, descending into the depths. Now, the depths means I started to race myself. I came over here to start researching. I came over in October of 1973. I said to my wife, I want to do it for 1 year because I've been working on cars all my life. Going to car races, I want to see what it's like to be out there. What's it like out there? The great question that Chris Economaki used to always ask drivers, what's it like out there? I wanted to experience it myself. So I started with a Datsun 510. It was crewed by me and my wife. My second driver's school was here. That was when I got my regional license. My first one was at Thompson in Connecticut, and then came up here. And that gave me a regional license. And then I could go racing. Numerous races in regional racing. We were twice a year up here. At the national level, it was either the Finger Lakes region, the New York region, or the New England region that was sanctioning it. And all of a sudden, here I was racing on a track that I was truly finding out what it's like out there. And I really, really liked it. It was the ultimate ability to be able to get out there and do what I'd always kind of thought would be pretty cool to do, but I wanted to experience it, and I was able to do that. And in 1981, I won the GT2 National Championship, and in 1981, I won the championship, and in 82, I started doing more club racing, but to qualify for the runoffs, I only needed to do 6 races because I was automatically qualified to come back. I don't know what the rule is now, but that was the rule then. But in 1982, I decided that maybe I should step up. And a good friend of mine, Bob Aiken, a dear friend, said, Rob, it's time to get out of club racing. So that was stage 3. You see how I'm descending into the depths or rising to the, elevating further up the pyramid, I guess? And I went from SCCA amateur racing to SCCA and IMSA professional racing. First in 83 and 84 in a GTO/Trans Am Pontiac Firebird, which was probably the lousiest car I'd ever driven. But by then I had a small crew of guys, there were 5 of us, and we learned a lot from that. And what I learned was how good our guys were and how we should also move up to take the next step to get into prototypes. It was there that I had a very interesting conversation with Bob Aiken because I related it to Bob. I said, Bob, I want to move up. He said, you should. He said that because we had won, we had come third in the 500-miler at Elkhart. I never did a lot of races in the Pontiac. And actually, after 1981, I never did a full season of racing in any form of any racing that Dyson Racing did. And I said, look, I'm going to go over to England and see the guys at March. And he shakes his finger just like this. Nobody collects marches. He said, the big thing you've got to do is get into a car that you know is going to work. I said, well, look, nobody can get the 962s. He says, let me call Hobart. You know Hobart. Why don't you call him? So I called Al, and I said, Al, I want to get a 962. He said, yeah, Aiken called me. He says, let me see what I can do. And shortly thereafter, we worked a transaction with Bruce Levin, who was a Bayside Disposal entrepreneur, who later became a very dear friend, who I shared several races with. And we were able to get the 962. We picked it up in March and raced it at Lime Rock, and we won our first race at Lime Rock. The thing that was interesting is one of my crew guys said, why don't we retire undefeated? We didn't, of course. So we started racing real cars, like Hobart says, you want to get into real racing. Here we were running the Porsches. To come up here to Watkins Glen at the sharp end of the entire field, to qualify with all of these great professional drivers and to go out and run with them. Going up the back straight that I had done so many times from my BMW to my Trans Am car, to my B sedan, to my Trans Am car, but then to do it in a 962 Porsche was an experience that, other than doing Le Mans, was kind of breathtaking, actually. Then there were a couple other professional races that I did here that was not in the 962, that was done in the Burger King 24 hours. That was one of the greatest events I've ever participated in. Burger King was part of the Firehawk Challenge, which was a showroom stock class. And showroom stock, it depended what manufacturer you were working with. I was driving with Bob Aiken. And depending on what showroom stock was, depending on how the manufacturer kind of said what was showroom stock and what wasn't. The advantage that we had better fuel economy and better wear on our tires. But those Burger King races had 70 or 80 cars running here at night. And even if you have 70 or 80 cars running here at night, Watkins Glen in the middle of the night is a very dark place to race. And then we started running other prototypes as I started getting less involved in the cars, and my son, Chris, his first professional race was up here. We had come up here the week before the IMSA race with the Rileys to do Goodyear tire testing. And Chris came up, and he had a spec racer Ford, and we let him run when we weren't running, when we were adjusting the car, changing something. And I said, why don't we just put Chris in the car and see how he would do? And in 6 laps, he would have finished 6th. He would have qualified 6th in the grid the year before. So I said to the organizers when the weekend started, I said, hey, I want to add my son. He's got a SCCA competition license. Can we give him an IMSA license? He's got all the medical. And Chris got in and drove his first pro race in a Riley. He took my time away from me in the 6 hour. And unfortunately, we had an electrical problem with the car, but Chris did a terrific job, and that led to him, barely a year later, he and James Wee were winning the 6 hours at Watkins Glen. When I think back, asked to reflect on my experiences here, coming here even today is like visiting an old friend. It's such a familiar place. Even getting up here is familiar. The roads, the surroundings, the town. It's been so many years of this being a part of my life. Just this past couple of months ago, we had a Rensport reunion. And at an autograph session, I was sitting next to Terry Bootson, who he and I became friends as a result of he was driving for Champion Racing in the 911s at all the racetracks. But it was funny, he came up here, came over to me and said, he had never been here before. This is Terry Bootson, a well-known, effective F1 and sports car champion. And he asked me, you know, what's the track like and all that, and I pointed out the different aspects of the boot and all that. And he, after the race, came up to me and he says, this is the best racetrack I've ever driven. He said, I've never experienced a track where you can get such a great rhythm and go so fast and enjoy the change in the elevation, but also the passing zones, the pit area. It was just a great experience. I felt great about that because that's exactly how I felt. But having a guy like this who's raced every fathomable racetrack except this place, coming to me and telling me, you know, Rob Dyson, who came here in 1963, he's telling me what a great racetrack it is as we both get out of our cars. The heritage of this place, because personally that I've experienced, the victories of mine and my son are really, when I think back on it, it's a gift. It's a gift to win a car race. But we've also been here for the tragedy too. And everybody can remember the F1, some of the F1 incidences that have happened here. Francois Sever being kind of the highest profile. I was here also when Graham Hill damn near got killed, broke both his legs when his car went end over end up in the back straight because of his suspension failure. But I think the other thing I want to reflect on is how important the International Motor Racing Research Center is. I finished a race up here. We had one in the mid-'80s, and Jean Argetsinger came up to me at the end of the race, and she said, Rob, I'm raising money at the Watkins Glen Library to start a motor racing library for the world to be able to come and do research. And it's going to be done out of the Watkins Glen Library. And I was wondering if you would want to contribute. Well, here we had just won, I think, about $180,000, which is a lot of money, camel money. Needless to say, when a woman like that asks you for money, right, boys, you respond, right? And that was my first gift to the International Motor Racing Research Center. And it's the gratitude that I have for the Argetsingers for preserving this place, creating it and then preserving it, and then seeing how it's been changed and how it's improved over the years. The bottom line here is that Watkins Glen is different than all the other racetracks because of its age and because of its heritage and because it's the same place that everybody raced on, Formula One, Can-Am, sports cars, Indy cars, all happened here. It's a wonderful place. The research center has been a remarkable resource for so many people, and I'm honored to have been a part of it. And I'm honored to be here today, and I thank you very much. Questions? I guess we'll have some questions. Anybody want to? I'm an old racer, so speak up.
I'd like to correct you on the highway. It was a town-maintained road you were on.
Oh, sorry.
The second course was town-maintained roads because the state tried to take and initiate laws to stop racing on public roads, and it failed in committee. Therefore, they wouldn't give us a permission with a permit, or Lloyd's would run through town. The second course was a town-maintained road, and also Reinhardt Road, which comes up the center from Gate 3, where the start-finish line was for the second course. And also, it was a Glen Region sanctioned events or Finger Lakes. I may on that here.
It was Finger Lakes region sanctioned here.
Club racing they did, and still do. And so doesn't the Glen region.
Right.
So, but anyway, I wanted to help you with that one too.
Well, thanks for the,
I'm Bill Green, and I'm the historian for the Glen region and the IMRRC.
thanks for the clarification. It wasn't the county, it was the town that was doing it. Just want to make sure, I will make sure that in future remarks, I'll make sure that I mention that. Remember, I'm an old racer here.
On the maps today, the section from Wedgewood Road Crossroads with Meads Hill has been abandoned, not abandoned, let lay under the trade when WGI bought the circuit here. The deal was, the first thing that was said to Frank Ganung, who was the supervisor of the town of Dix at that time, Jim Riesbeck says, how can we close the public roads? And he said, it won't be hard. And it was done. That he was looking at the tourism, and he wasn't a race fan. He was my stepfather. So, but anyways, I wanted to tell you that too. And that was done in Corning at one of the meetings with WGI and the town. So that's just for information.
Well, good. I thought it was just the Argetsingers, but I guess we got to thank him as well. You know, interesting.
Mr. Dyson, do you recall the first time that you went off track in your early racing career, and how did you feel? Were you disappointed, or did you just have fire in the belly to come back?
I'm not sure I heard the question. Just say that again, will you?
Early in your racing career, do you remember the first time that you went off track, and how did you feel about that? Were you disappointed, or did you have the fire to come back?
It's the old saying, if you're not up on the curbs, you're not trying hard enough. Like Mario Andretti says, if you're not out of control 90% of the time, you're not going quick enough. Sometimes I went up over, like the 11th, 10th. The only thing I can tell you is that ground effects does not work on the grass. I try not to think about where I went off the first time, but I can remember one thing. I can remember when I backed up a hay wagon at the farm, and the hitch broke, and the hay wagon rolled back into my mother's garden. I can remember another time when my younger brother and I were washing my brother's car, and my younger brother went into the interior and tripped the parking brake, so when we left the car that was clean, it had just rolled into the farm pond, and we had to get the tractors pretty quick before my brother got home. But actually, look, if you're racing, you're gonna one time or another, you're gonna meet a obstacle. And I don't remember actually ever doing it up here. I think this was a place you were going pretty quick. You didn't want to be careful. I guess the biggest ride I ever took probably was at Lime Rock, coming down the downhill in a 510, and I went off the track coming down the straight, and I stayed straight and then bounced along the straightaway until the car slowed, and then went back on the racetrack. Look, you got to just gather it up and keep going. It's one of those things, it's just a behavioral thing. You just, you're in the moment, and you just got to keep going. So I never had any fear, although I will tell you that I was constantly afraid of the dark until I did Le Mans in 1986. It was the only time I did it. And it was cold and dark and raining in the middle of the night, and doing 220 miles an hour down the back straight in the dark with the rain beating on the windshield. All of a sudden, I kind of put a lot of things in perspective, and I'm not afraid of the dark anymore.
Is there any certain aspect of the racetrack here that you find most prevalent racing on, or like least prevalent, like the boot or the 90, for example?
See, I can't quite hear. What was the question again?
Which part of the circuit do you find the most fun here, Watkins Glen, or like the least fun when you were driving?
You mean here?
Yes.
This place? Pretty hard to pick out a place that is not kind of interesting. You know, the best thing about Watkins Glen, it's a very fair track. Whoever did the initial design, I get, but when they did the boot, whoever did that was inspired because they really made it. First, they made it longer. The pit, the length was extensively lengthened. The loop, the inner loop, which we raced a couple of times in IMSA, I found was not very interesting. I'll tell you a funny story. We were up here testing, and they brought, I think they brought up one of the NASCAR guys. I'll think of his name in a minute. Anyway, they brought him up here to run a NASCAR car around we were doing Goodyear testing, and they brought up a NASCAR car to drive around to see what it would like to take the stock car race and run through the inner loop. And Bobby Labonte. And he came and ran the car around several laps, and he came up, he said, look, you know, you'll put so many cars in that downhill, that when you go down a hill and turn left in the boot, coming off the loop, you come down. He said, you'll have more cars piled into there. You'll never get a race run. So needless to say, they said, okay, we won't ever run it. And they still don't, right? They still don't run the boot. They just run the loop, right? Right? Okay. But this track is fair. It's fast, but it's fair. But I will tell you that after the Francois Cerver crash, Jackie Stewart rated the S's as the most dangerous corners in the world for Formula One. I find that incredibly hard to believe that was true. But they then went on a campaign to alter the approach to the S's in a variety of different ways. Hay bales, constructing a funny fence so then you had to slow and come through it, downshift first, second gear to come up. They're racing now, of course, the cars, I will tell you, cars are a lot safer now than they were when I started racing. But now, I think enough people have enough knowledge about how to run those S's, and I think that everybody understands that this is a pretty fast part of the course, that was appropriate. When I first started racing here, though, they did not have the chicane. You went ripping into that at the end of the front straight, of the back straight, going up the hill. You were really flying. And that corner going down to the downhill, that was pretty exciting. I've got to tell you, that was one that you really, of all the racetracks that I've raced on at that time, and even now when I think about it, that was a very fast corner. And it was after a couple of incidences that they decided maybe we better slow the cars down a little, which they did through that little chicane there. But the course is just great. It's fast, it's wide, it's got plenty of places to pass. They've moved, obviously, with the big cars and the stock car guys and all that. And the way tracks are being run now, they've moved all the walls back. Get the walls, but when we first started racing here, the walls were right along the perimeter of the racetrack, but on either side of the track. But now it's opened up a lot more, so people and some parts of the curbing is widened up. But even in the old days, when they first built the boot and we first started running it, it was just a fabulous racetrack, and continues, in essence, the same configuration as it was then, it is now. Super, it's a great racetrack. I want to reflect on one final thing that I didn't bring up. My first race here was a regional race in 1974. My last race was the 6 hour in 2007. And when I got out of the car in 2007, I said, well, I just felt that that was it. And when I got out of the car and walked away, I didn't think about it till my son the next day said, Dad, that was the site of your first race, wasn't it? I said, yeah. He said, did you intend to make it your first and last race would be Watkins? I said, no. But if I ever wanted to make it a decision, it was the right one. So this track has been such a part of my life. And now I'm a proud father watching my son. And based on what I'm seeing around the shop with the go-karts, and I'm hearing about a local little speedway, maybe I'll be seeing my grandchildren up here too. It's a great place, and I'm honored to be here. Any other questions? I'll be around. I'm staying for dinner. Got a microphone over there? Thanks for having me, folks. Hope I'm not keeping everybody.
Oh, no, we'll do one more question.
Well, my husband's first question was he'd love to have a beer with you sometime. No. My question is, from the transition from being a race fan to being a race driver to then being a race father, what is your favorite stage?
All of them.
Sure.
At the time, everyone seemed to kind of work. You know, it was it's truly an evolution of a racing career, I guess you could say. Actually, it wasn't until I was asked to do this that I actually started to put my thinking together. That really it's the evolution of a racing career. Mm-hmm. There are very few drivers that are driving in cars that are racing cars that didn't start off as race fans. I find it hard to believe that they wouldn't have had some kind of inkling that they wanted to go racing at some time or another, as kids or whatever. So I think what it was is it's the evolution of a race fan becoming a race driver. I mean, it was important for me to get out there because I figured I was 27 years old. I didn't have any kids. I just came out of grad school. I had just started my broadcasting business. And I said, I've got to do this, if for no other reason but to say that at least I understand what's going on. But that was in 1974, and I'm still doing it. I'm not driving cars, but the race shop, the race team, all of what's going on. My son just called me. I mean, I'm into it up to here. And then with all the other things I'm doing with the Speedway Museum and the Research Center, which Chris is now a part of, I mean, it never ends, and you don't want it to end because it's such a captivating sport. I mean, it's just interesting. And it is all stories. Anybody that's here can relate half a dozen stories about this place. Whether you were at the bog or whether you were, watching or seeing Jim Clark or hearing the Matras go up the back straight, or watching the Indy cars in the 70s and 80s. I mean, it's just, it's stories, it's memories, it's things that you'd rather be here than anywhere else when you were here. That's the way I felt at every racetrack, and it's still the way I feel. Whenever I go through the gates of a racetrack, after all these years and after all these races, whenever I go through the gates of a racetrack, my heart just beats a little quicker. And why is that? Because it's so goddamned interesting. And you know that there's going to be something that's going to educate you. Something is going to give you a sense of more awareness of something. And this place is one of the best places, in my opinion, the best place to experience that. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you so much. Now we get the next one up.
shit. Yep. Okay, now you can go.
Talk about a hard act to follow. I've been down over here, now I'm up here. Believe it or not, this is the first presentation I made in the seventh edition of the Argetsinger Symposium. It took me seven tries to get up here and get my paper approved. So I'm Don Capps. I'm one of the co-founders of this, and one of the people that gives credit to everybody else. You guys are all making it happen. I wanted to talk about something I came across as a historian of motorsport. Vacuums to historians are like catnip. When your ignorance and your lack of knowledge about a topic becomes evident, you just find yourself into that void. You start looking. I knew a lot about Formula One, Grand Prix, sports car sort of thing. Having grown up in Europe, having got that interest, I had friends. Paul Sheldon, who was one of the co-founders of the Formula One Register, was a dear friend of mine. They created the record of Grand Prix and Voiturette racing, and it was very interesting. We had a lot of correspondence. And in one of our exchanges, he says, you know, I love sprint car racing. I love American racing. And I was stunned because here's the person who is the expert. All that information you see out there on the internet about results from Formula One racing, it was taken from their research. So I said, okay. He says, Don, I want you to think seriously about looking into American racing. And I said, okay, so how do I do this? I'm really not that familiar with American racing per se and what's available. Well, 20-something years later, about 25 years later, here I am, trying to give you some idea. When I started looking into this, I started focusing on the early years, up to about 1920, because that was an area that I found a big void. And I started digging and digging and digging. And the more I started digging, the more I found. The more I found, the more I started looking elsewhere. And one of the things that became evident to me over time was there is basically, whoops, here we go. Is this thing working? Not working. There we go. I put a hex on all this technology, sorry to say anything. One of the things I found is just like you'll find in many cases in history, there is a market, there is this incredible glut of books, articles about year things change. It's, 1948, 1944, 1816. And it kind of occurred to me as I was doing my research that there was a year that kept kind of popping up as I looked through all this material that I began collecting and been researching and looking into. And the year ended up being 1908, which is not the year I would have anticipated. Once I took that step back as a historian and started looking at the context and the objectivity of where are some dividing points. And I kept coming back, looking at it, and it came back always to 1908. Well, why 1908? Here are just a few of the things that happened in 1908 in American racing. The appearance of road racing. There had been the the William K. Vanderbilt Junior Cup, but that was it. The New York to Paris event took place. The New York State Automotive Association changes its dues assessed. We're going to come to that, which meant that the Automobile Club of America withdrew from the American Automobile Association. The international organization, which is now the FIA, the AICA, or back in those days, sided with the Automobile Club of America, not the AAA, in this dispute. We'll come to that. Then there was agreement. The Vanderbilt Cup was held out on Long Island, and of course it was the Locomobile that won. Number 16, George Robertson and all that. They had the first race in Savannah, and I can say right now I'm one of the probably few people in the world that has flown the old route in an OH-58 Kiowa. Boys and their toys sort of deals when I was at Fort Stewart. And it's also one of the places that comes back to this coming together. It's one of the first seasons that season reviews, the first year that season reviews began to appear. And there was the Motor Contest Association, which nobody's ever heard of probably, starts to contact the AAA. So it comes down to three things. The road racing arrives in the United States, the schism between the ACA and the AAA, and the appearance of season reviews. These are the things that kind of coalesced in my thinking when I looked at it. Well, first one, of course, is obvious, road racing. In January 1909, in Motor Age, this is the first review of American road racing that's been published. Take my word for it. If you can find an early one, good for you. I have looked everywhere. And it was written by a guy, C.G. Chris Sensabaugh. And if you see on the right side, that is a listing of all the road races in the United States that year. The number the year before, 0. There was no Vanderbilt Cup in 1907. And here you have this incredible list. In some races, it's kind of amazing. Mount Baldy race in Los Angeles. There was a race, a very interesting race from Jacksonville to Miami. Just a number of things. All the races in Savannah. So this is a big deal. Suddenly we go from no road racing. In 1908, suddenly we have a glut. We've got 21 separate road races out of nowhere. That's a big change because, again, suddenly road racing is a big deal. Motor Age and the automobile, horseless age, now they're big deals. They take front page of an issue. So that's a change. Of course, where does that lead us? In American racing, there was after 1916, 1920, well actually 1920, the last Elgin race. Not until 1933 did you have another road race of any consequence. That was at Elgin for stock cars. And then you had the Mines Field race. How many of you flown into LAX? If you have, that's Mines Field, right on that location. That was 1934. And of course, in 36 and 37, you have the George Vanderbilt Cup races that happened. So 1908 is when road racing really becomes an American thing. And amazingly enough, in 1948, we have the race here at Watkins Glen, the Watkins Glen Grand Prix, which leads us to like Riverside, the first Grand Prix for sports cars. That's a big little bit of PR sort of thing. And of course, then the race here. I picked the 1961 race mostly because I was here for that one. The second thing that really got me, because I'm into digging into conflicts inside racing. I love that sort of thing because it tells you a lot. The schism between the Automobile Club of America and the AAA. It was a big story. There's an article starting from the left. That's from the New York Times. There's a war going on. A publication called Motor talks about ACA versus AAA, then Motor World, another publication. I was very confused about this whole thing because I didn't know a lot about the Automobile Club of America. Found it was organized in 1899. Its first racing rules were published in 1901. And despite being told by numerous people they didn't exist, I found them. They were an original member of the AAA. In fact, they were one of the organizing clubs of the 7 clubs that organized it in 1902. One of the problems with the ACA was not long after the AAA was formed, when there was a transition going on about the racing, on Staten Island there was speed trials, and there was the torpedo, the Baker torpedo, ran off the race after establishing the point, almost a speed record for 1 kilometer, went into the crowd, killed several people, injured others, and the organizer of that club the promoter was the Automobile Club of America. So they were on a line for liabilities. They passed several they looked at this whole thing and said, we're not going to do road racing. We're not going to do anything on public roads, which meant that in 1904, when you had the first Vanderbilt Cup, that's why AAA, not the Automobile Club of America, was the sanctioning body, because they had passed resolutions saying we're not going to do anything that involves public roads. The only thing we'll do is like maybe reliability trials and so forth, which is interesting because it was an international event, and in May of 1904, the ACA became a member of the Automobile Clubs International, the International Organization of Recognized Automobile Clubs, what is in English, what is now the FIA, was established in Germany. They were the official American member. They were recognized as the official American Automobile Club. In 1908, the ACA resigned from the New York State Automobile Association. I could never figure out how ACA got into racing in 1908 until this came up. And it had nothing to do with racing. It was a dues change. There had been a cap of $500 per club. And then the New York State Automobile Association said, no, we're going to do it per member. Well, the ACA had about 1,200 members, which meant that their dues more than increased by, doubled. So they got angry about that, had a falling out. They fell out with the ACA, with the AAA. ACA went its own way. The agreement with the American Automobile Association, later on I'll talk about that, was who was going to be the international representative of the United States and who was going to be the national club for racing within the United States. That's what that's all about. The ACA finally came back into the AAA in the 1920s, something I was not aware of. Again, my ignorance is only exceeded by my lack of knowledge of this topic for the most part until I started digging into this. The American Automobile Association, still around. Organized in 1902, as I said, the Racing Board was one of the original committees. The first racing rules were issued in 1903. I was told they didn't exist, yet I found them. The Vanderbilt Cup, they were the sanctioning club for that. They actually held the first national championship, the National Motor Car Championship, in 1905, and Barney Oldfield was the winner of that championship. But it kind of vanished into thin air. In 1907, there was no Vanderbilt Cup. The falling out over racing, because the international, AIACR, sided with the Automobile Club of America. An agreement was made, just like I just told you. The Automobile Club of America would be the international organization for racing, etc. The AAA would do national racing, things within the United States. So they had that. The Motor Contest Association, which was made of the manufacturers, came to the AAA in late 1908, early 1909, a result of this agreement to have the AAA be the sanctioning body officially and be funded, and that happened in 1909. The AAA, and you see the dates, 1916, 1920 to 1941, and again from 1946 to 1955, had national championships. The ACA was replaced at the AIACR by the AAA in 1928, particularly on the SCI, the International Sporting Committee. And then in the end of 1955, the AAA leaves racing. So that is a canned idea, something that a time frame and some explanation had no idea about. I'd never read it anywhere. And for a racing historian, it was a little bit of embarrassing. One of the reasons I found myself going back to 1908, because it sets up this whole series of conflicts. When you start going back to the roots, if American racing organizations aren't fighting, they're not doing anything. You go back to AAA versus IMCA. You go back to AAA versus NASCAR. USAC versus NASCAR. USAC versus SCCA. USAC versus CART. CART versus IRL. IRL versus, so you get an idea. And I realize I look back at things, this all seems to roll back to 1908 and that conflict with ACA. Again, catnip for historians, this kind of started explaining things to me. Now, the third thing that got me was season reviews. Prior to the end of the 1908 season, all the publications, whether it's Motor World, Motor Age, Horseless Age, the Automobile, whatever, did not do season reviews. But within a week of each other, in the late end of December 1908 and in the first week of January 1909, you find these two season reviews being published independently. That is a remarkable change, because what happens is they become an annual affair. And I wanted you to notice, the one in Motor Age, the one on the right, that appeared in Motor Age. In Motor Age the next year, as a result of doing these season reviews, says, oh yeah, we're going to name a champion driver, which just happens to be Bert Dingley. Next year, they named the champion road racing driver. That's something that I did not catch at first, champion road racing driver. And what's kind of interesting is in 1911, it's a person most of you probably never heard of. I hadn't, and that's Harvey Herrick, champion road racing of the United States. Ring a bell? California guy. Again, of course, the 1914 is a very obvious one, and that's Ralph De Palma. So that starts to, so this is something that I go back again to 1908. This continues, this idea of racing champion. It gets a little more complicated. By 1915, it's gotten really complicated. On the left side of the screen, it's the Racing Champions 1915. That's in the horseless age. And inside, you'll see in those little box, they looked at road racing and they looked at track racing. And they came up with a champion. It was Earl Cooper. Then in Motor Age, did road racing and speedway racing and track racing. They had three different sets of championships in 1 year, three different issues. And then in motor, they had not only road racing, again, that was Earl Cooper and the Stutz, but they also had track racing. So you now have all these champions being named by periodicals. In 1916, however, AAA now has an official national championship. bang, there it is. And of course, it's Darrell Resta in his Peugeot. But 1917 to 1919, there was no national champion. In 1920, they created it again. It was, but in 1954, Russ Catlin starts publishing a history of national championship racing, and this is in December 1954, and he said, Robinson or Dingley, he creates he looks at one set of facts that have been in the file, and says, yeah, there might be a question. And what happens is, all those champions that were being named by motor age, postless age, the automobile, well, suddenly they become official champions later on. Now, that has a lot, as a historian, and I think, Rob, you just found out, around here, if you say something, you're going to get corrected by Bill Green or someone. I mean, that is the nature of historians. Again, except for some people like Tom and a few others who really had looked into this, I found myself in the wilderness doing this topic because hardly anybody had looked at it as an academic, if you will. I had gone into the archives, various places, gone through all these journals. Your eyes fall out after a while, trying to sort fact from fiction, particularly in the 50s, 60s, 70s, when all this kind of gets altered around. People who were never champions are now national champions. Which brings me to IndyCar. Well, last little word here. The trophy that they give out for the Astor Cup, Challenge Cup, they have a base it sits on. On that base, it has all the national champions. The problem is, and this is where the historian in me just goes berserk, is the fact that it's wrong. You know, we get up and jump up and down and go, it's wrong, we can't stand it. Again, historians, you ask what time is, we'll give you a history of how time was formed and how it was created. Talk about handheld calculator, we'll tell you all about calculation and how we got to calculators. This bothers me to no end. I have fought with IndyCar now for several years to get this corrected, and it's like, thank you, we hear you, have a nice life, don't call us, we're going to call you again. But if you can't see it very well, but it starts off with 1909 and George Robinson. What bothers me is in 1920, there were 5 races. The champion that was crowned that year was a posthumous champion, Gaston Chevrolet, who died in Los Angeles on Thanksgiving Day. He had enough points to be the champion, not by much, but enough. Later, for some reason, some people with time on their hands went back and looked at some other races, added them in, and suddenly it's Tommy Milton. And I found out when I started looking at this controversy, there's a wonderful person who's no longer with us, unfortunately, died almost 10 years ago now, John Glen Prince. I got to know John very, very well. And this bothered him, and it bothered me. There was an exchange in IndyCar Racing magazine, as a matter of fact, with Bob Baruso. As a historian, we love, believe in, live and die by footnotes in our research. Everything, and I think, I looked at, led me to believe, Tommy Milton I have great admiration for. Wonderful driver, one of the best. He deserved the championship in 1921. But it was Gaston Chevrolet. Yeah, IndyCar most often will, they say one thing, but when you look at what they have on their website, for instance, it still leads you to believe it's Tommy Milton. And that was part of how I got back to 1908. See how historians work? We had that I never dreamed that that 1 year could be so influential. But the rise of the road racing, that schism between the organizations, and again, this whole idea of something as innocuous as those season reviews. All that kind of comes together. And again, it makes my heart really sore when we have people out there who say, yeah, I think I can start tracking on this. Now, give credit where credit's due. It had not been for the International Motor Racing Research Center, a lot of what I have just talked to you about would not have been possible. Resources here, contacts made through here, open doors, made things happen. So that's one of the reasons this is important to have this type of exchange. This is why we exist. This is what it's all about. This is my little donation to this ocean of knowledge, my little drops in there. This is why we formed this. Mike Argetsinger and I talked about this for ages. Then, unfortunately, Mike passed away. Pat Young, Dr. Pat Young, Professor Emeritus of Literature at University of Houston, along with myself and a great crew, put together this initial one. We only had 3 people, and this is the sort of thing I wanted to get talked about. You know, Rob talks about getting emotional about being on the track. I get emotional about it when it talks about this is one of the places that was created by Gene Argetsinger so that people like me and other people here could come together, do research, share our findings, and make things happen. So thank you for the patience. And if there are any questions, forget it. I'm not going to answer. No. But quite seriously, thank you. This is a work of love, not just this presentation, but what you guys are doing and so forth. So, any question? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I think what happened in '08 was there were a lot of European cars that came over here, and they had to have a place to run them. I think that was one of it.
Yeah.
And you're absolutely right on that Vanderbilt Cup, that thing and that's one of the things that the Speedway Museum has pointed out to those guys, that Tommy Milton was everybody's fan favorite, but you know, he drove the Duesenbergs and he was a kind of a fair-haired boy, but Gaston Chevrolet was the guy that won it. We've told them about that. So that's kind of interesting. Also, I want to say that the Speedway Museum has all of the AAA records.
I know.
All of the AAA records, and they're available for anybody to come and take a look at. So, but I think what happened in '08 was the fact you had a lot of European cars that were running around and they came over. Mercedes especially.
What you got was a sanitized, got the 30-minute version of the 8-hour lecture. Because you're absolutely correct. The appearance of European cars, but particularly from about 04, 03, 04, up until right at the end of the beginning of the 20s, into the 20s, that had a lot to do with this creation. Again, I had to pack a lot down, but you hit it spot on. The number of European automobiles on the track, not just on the road courses, but on the tracks themselves, meant that at some point, particularly in 06, 07, that there was going to be some transition, a point where this all came up. And I would have mentioned, but I will now, had not been for those files that I got access to, thank you, IMRRC, that I got access because of the connections we made here to those files. I had the microfilm copies that were made by Gordon White, with courtesy of the museum, those things. That was a revelation. You're absolutely correct. That changed everything for me. That really added substance and context to all those little things that weren't making sense. And that was one of the, I think that was why this is all catnip. None of this was making sense. But as you correctly pointed out, there was this, all these things came together. And like I said, 1908 just happened to be the year that I saw this sort of synergy begin to shift things. Because if you look from 1907 back, then you look at 08 forward, there is a definite change. There really is a definite change in American race. You have to take a long view, but that really is a turning point. Okay. Anyway, thank you very much for your patience. I will. I'll go back to my microphone.
We have a break, 15 minutes.
Yeah. Give you a chance to recover from that.
Your seats, please. Take your seats.
Okay, let's go ahead and get started with our next presentation. Our next presentation is, I get to say this, I get to use some of my Italian. Argento e Rosso, an alternate history of the mid-engine revolution by Karl-Heinz Mertins. I love this topic. This is one of those things, thinking out counterfactual history is something that's being used a lot now to examine different events in history. And I love this. So I'm going to turn it back. I'm looking forward to this one. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Did it really need to take 25 years from the first cars that were winning Grand Prix races with the engine mounted behind the driver until it became commonplace, and then all the US Grand Prix that were held here at this wonderful racetrack were all contested by and won by cars that had the engine mounted behind the driver. It seemed to be the most normal thing in the world. So let me run you through a few stages of what happened in reality, and then I will veer off into what I would submit as an alternative reality. And you can dispute that, and you can criticize me for some of the stupidities that I will throw out here. But it's something that I've been thinking about for a long time, and now in retirement I've had time to really devote some quality time to this topic, and I want to share this with you, but I invite you to be critical with me. So I start here at the year 1937, and this is just one of the races that were counting towards the European Championship of drivers. And what you see here is the typical view in those years. There are many silver cars, and they have just a sprinkle of red. There's a lot of Argento, a little sprinkle of Rosso in this image. The lone Alfa Romeo here of Tasio Nuvolari. In the pole position here is Bernd Rosemeyer,
in an Auto Union race car, and as you may deduct here, the engine is really mounted behind the driver, whereas all the Mercedes cars in the vicinity here, Hermann Lang and Caracciola here, they all have the typical classical front-engined cars, just like the Thomas Flyer that we learned about on Thursday evening, had the engine mounted in front of the person that drives the car, or the two people that were sitting there. That seemed to be the norm. Why even question that? And yet we know from many instances in industry, in art and so on, things change, and sometimes they have to change for good reasons. But what was the underlying situation here, I want to point out quickly, was that this happened all under the 750 kilogram formula that the CSI brought into action because the previous cars were getting too fast and too powerful. And the thought was, well, if you limit the weight of the dry weight of the car to 750 kilograms, then not much can happen. The engines will have to become smaller, and there is just no chance for increase in performance and perhaps decrease in safety of running these cars on the given tracks. The opposite happened. The rule makers did not really anticipate the tremendous progress that happened in metallurgy, in engineering in general, in tires, in many areas that compose the car. And what happened was the technical complexity went up dramatically. The performance of these cars compared to the previous ones went up dramatically, and the dominance that was held by the red cars, the Rosso element, switched over to the Argento, to the silver cars, the ones that happened to be made in Germany, where I also come from. And as you see in the results here, the first three finishers were silver cars, Mercedes in the first two places, Auto Union number 3, and Tasio Nuvolari with several minutes distance came in as fourth. 2 years prior, by the way, he had won this race because this man, von Brauchitsch, was abusing his tires, and he didn't want to stop for a second tire change, and he paid heavily for that, and Nuvolari was the winner, the surprise winner. The organizers were not prepared to have a foreigner win the German Grand Prix. They were struggling to get the national anthem dug out and all those things. And it took a while for the spectators to recognize that they had a different winner than what they had expected. So there were a number of things happening under the 750 kilogram formula, but by and large it was a duel between the silver arrows of Mercedes-Benz and Auto Union. This period was one of disruptions. I think what became evident was that a complex car could no longer be designed and constructed by a singular genius, by an artisan, a craftsperson. It went to teams of specialists that replaced those individuals. That was difficult for some people, and as an example, Ettore Bugatti perhaps, and more pertinent to this talk than Vittorio Jano, were more in this category. I would say they may not have been the best leaders of a team of specialists, and that's what came about. You can see here the Mercedes core team of their racing department, led by Uhlenhaut. And he was also the person that focused very much on a new chassis paradigm, where previously chassis were pretty flimsy affairs, and the wheel suspension was pretty hard. And the chassis was basically the suspension system, spring system. That changed dramatically when the chassis was fortified and became much more stable. We also saw, as in the previous image, that the mid-engined car concept became competitive. It was almost equal to the conventionals. So when that happened in a very short period of time, that's pretty amazing and should tell people that there's something to it, because typically it takes a while for the new challenger to challenge an incumbent, because the incumbent has naturally some 50 years of experience to refine the concept. So this was telling. I think also the fascist governments in Italy and in Germany started to use and abuse GP racing for propaganda purposes. So it was no longer a matter of the individual driver and the team to be successful. Now you had to be successful for the whole nation, or you would be criticized by masses and by the leadership. There were state subsidies paid in Germany, but they were relative minor contributions to the overall budget. This space race, so to speak, that happened in Germany was much more expensive than, say, the sums that were paid by the government. Going forward, Mercedes was well known, of course, but the challenger was Auto Union, not really an organization with a long history. Well, it was a company that was born out of necessity. There were 4 companies in Saxony, in Germany, and they were closely related geographically, but they all 4 had the same financial troubles, and they had difficulties growing. The banks, namely the Saxon State Bank, was very worried about their investments, and they said something needs to change here. Why don't we bring those 4 companies together and work towards economies of scale? So in 1932, those 4 companies, previously independent, Audi, DKW, or DKW, Horch and Wanderer, were brought together into this Auto Union AG. The company kept a multiple brand strategy. When you look at these bar graphs, you see that the portion of the bars here stands for the DKW contribution here. A very simple and low-cost car made the majority of this business in terms of volume, sold cars per year. And you can see over the years there was quite an increase. The company, Auto Union, became the number 2 in Germany, but not many people knew about the name and could relate the name to specific projects and products. So either they had to go big time into advertising or to go racing and make a name for themselves. Now, Wanderer, one of the 4 constituents, had already had a good relationship with Dr. Porsche's, Ferdinand Porsche's engineering office out of Stuttgart, and he had designed some of the very successful Wanderer cars and engines for those 4-cylinder, 6-cylinder. And he also had plans already in his back pocket for a car for this, what was called then the P-Wagen or P-Wagen, a 4.4-liter V16 Grand Prix car with the engine mounted behind the driver. Wanderer was almost sold on it, but they had to get approval from the Auto Union holding company. It took a while to get there, but finally that came to pass, particularly when the political landscape shifted around at this time, and Hitler came into power, and he was very much into mass mobilization and automobile propagation, and he wanted to demonstrate, of course, the essential superpower of the German nation, and it could be demonstrated in some sort of a space race that at that point was auto racing. Now, the Porsche design, quite intricate and complex, was only that. It was a design. Porsche's engineering office did not build anything really other than some rough prototypes. So it had to be done within Auto Union, that they had to come up with a real car, and that was, the task was given to this gentleman here who smokes, and the full picture would show there's a race car in his vicinity, and this is taken at the boxes. And it was Robert Eberhard von Eberhorst, and his statement was from the get-go, he was completely convinced that this, what he then called the rear engine concept, was really the real deal, and he was fully behind propagating that. Here we learn a little bit more about Ferdinand Porsche's P-Wagen, as documented in patent literature here. And what you see here in particular is, of course, the general concept of the car. The engine is here, the gearbox cantilevering behind the rear axle. But what he pointed out in this particular patent text and it claims was that the line here, the yellow line, which is close to what we today would call the roll axis of the vehicle. In those days, the term had not been coined, but he pointed out this axle was very important, and it should go through the center of gravity of the unsprung masses. When that was accomplished, then there would be no sideways inclinations of the car, and they would be absolutely done with, and the car would really hold the road like a board sliding over the road. There would be no tilting or rolling of the car. You can see a little bit here, Bernd Rosemeyer negotiating a corner at the Donington circuit in England. And you can see that there's not much roll here, but there's a lot of oversteer and opposite lock. And it wasn't easy to control these cars at the time because there's a bit of a flaw in this concept that looks good on paper, that there should be no roll. A roll is a pretty good previous or early indicator that the car is getting closer to its limits, the adhesion limits of the tires. And so you want to have a little bit of roll, otherwise the driver will get much more surprised by the rear stepping out. But that was a lesson after World War II. We skipped that dark part of history. The silver arrows were pretty much out of business. The Auto Union, as it was known then, was out of business. It was partially located in the Russian zone, what became then East Germany, and the smart people that worked there tried to get out of Dodge as quickly as possible, and they reestablished some smaller organization in West Germany, a new Auto Union, but not nearly as potent as the original was. And Mercedes-Benz, the factories were in smithereens, and they had to slowly rebuild their core business. Alfa Romeo, on the other hand, had a couple of challengers for post-World War II Grand Prix racing at their disposal. They were smart enough to hide those assets well, protect them throughout the war, and they had two concepts. And one was what we know as the 158 Alfetta, which was a conventional car with the engine in front. And there was the second one that was the 512 that was very much modeled after the Auto Union race cars. And you can see here, it had a very high roll center in the rear axle, and it pretty much copied the same slope of the roll axis as the Porsche patented outline. This was more or less a brainchild or a project directed by Wilfredo Ricard, who was a very theoretical man, studied, not necessarily the most practical person, and not a person who interacted well with the more practical people, maybe the previous artisan generation. There was a bit of a wall between them. So he persisted with this relatively high roll center here the DVO axle at the back shows that. There's a Watts linkage in this resolution of this image. It doesn't show very well, but this red arrow points to it. It was an unusual high placement of the roll center, the lateral arresting point, if you want so, of the DVO tube. And so that was a bit of a flaw, hence there were some issues with the road holding of that prototype. There were almost 2 512s completed. The first one was tested in 1940. It showed some difficulties with road holding. Now, on the other hand, the 158 had its own chassis impairments that would show up later as the engine horsepower increased quite dramatically. But for now, you could argue when Alfa Romeo decided what to go racing with after World War II, the Alfetta was the more reasonable choice. Early on, way back when I first thought about this alternative history thing, this was seemed to be a perfect deviation point, you know, where you deviate from real history into La La Land. And my first thought was, why don't we just shift from one car to the mid-engined car, the 512. Well, it is not quite that easy as it showed once I dug in, once I did a little bit of my way of research and dug into literature and all kinds of prior art that existed at the time. It seemed that there were issues, obviously, in the design, which could have been changed and further developed. However, when Ugo Gobato, who was running Alfa Romeo at the time, was assassinated in 1945, Ricard, who came originally from Spain, felt for his own safety it was best to go back to Barcelona. And he had not made many friends within the Alfa organization, so when he left, there were not many disciples that would have picked up and would have continued the development of this quite visionary design of the 512. The engine, by the way, was certainly a superior element in that whole design compared to the 158. So the revolution was suspended, and my story couldn't pivot at that point. Now, in the meantime, while Alfa Romeo was quite successful and earned the Driver World Championship in 1950 and 51, at the beginning of the Formula One as we know it, Mercedes was still rebuilding the core business, but they had declared already in 51 that by 54, when the new 2.5-liter Formula One would come into being, that they would start participating in it. Now, they had a new project leader in Hans Schernberg, but they also had some of the old experienced guys like Alfred Neubauer, Rudolf Uhlenhaut at their disposal to start building this next generation of Silver Arrow. And they had roughly 200 staff members at their disposal, which is a huge number of engineers and technicians and fabricators in those days. So they were going all out. They were not kidding when they said in 54 we want to be on the racetrack again. And they had further access to about 300 specialists within the corporation that they could get information from on a part-time basis. So there was a lot of potential there in terms of engineering horsepower know-how. They also worked quite well with Bosch, that they had been working with as a partner during World War II on fuel injection systems. So they got a lot of help there in optimizing their direct fuel injection system, which was also an improvement over competition. And so you wondered who could be an opponent for this onslaught by Mercedes-Benz after World War II. Certainly none of the German companies. We had already briefly stressed Auto Union, the newly formed GmbH, wasn't really in a position to do that. They didn't have the means. Borgward, who was kind of a multi-brand cluster of companies as well, they were into touring car racing to some extent. Veritas was a very small-scale builder of race cars, kind of a silver arrow that they tried, and they used the BMW 328 engine for their efforts. Well, as they were not that successful, BMW asked them to stop using their engine, and then they had to make their own engine, and they dabbled with two-cycle engines. They wouldn't go anywhere. They didn't have anywhere near these resources. So that didn't work out well. Meanwhile, in Italy, after Alfa Romeo was already quite successful with the pre-war designs, and they were thinking about they needed to have a new design in order to stay competitive. Loraghi, who was then running Alfa Romeo, and his leadership team felt it was enough with racing, and it was good to stop at the height of their success rather than continuing and risking to lose the glory that they had accumulated. Ferrari was, particularly in the context of mid-engined cars, a big opponent. To him, the ox or horse always must pull the cart. That was his thought. Kind of a faulty analogy, because even front-engined cars push the car as long as it's rear-wheel driven. And then there was Cisitalia, who was a small company with huge ambitions, and they had contracted the Porsche engineering team to design the 360, a very advanced mid-engined Formula car, Grand Prix car, that was very complex, and Duzio, who owned Cisitalia at the time, was way over his head, I think, in terms of financial commitments and understanding how much it would take beyond the initial design of a car. You have to field it, and then you have to also be aware that when you start, even if you're very competitive at the beginning, the competition isn't going to sleep. There will be upgrades, and you will have to upgrade yours. And so they just didn't have, based on their relatively small, tiny boutique car company with beautiful cars, with bodywork styled by Farina, and they were popular, but they didn't make much money, so there wasn't anywhere near the financial wherewithal to support a Grand Prix project like this. The engine, by the time 54 would roll in, the 1.5-liter turbocharged engine, or supercharged engine, I should say, was obsolete. So they would have to get a different engine. But by 49, Cisitalia was pretty much bankrupt, and Duzio took the car and himself over to Argentina, and there was no real engineering support. So this project, which was very promising, died out before it ever really got onto a racetrack. Also, they waited way too long to do the first on-track tests. They wanted to build 6 cars, ideally, and then think it was perfect to go racing. So they didn't really worry much about the four-wheel drive that was part of this car, and to try it out and to understand how does it work on straight ahead and in curves and so on. So there was a lot of over-optimism that ruled that project. Scuderia Milan was even more optimistic in coming up with a kind of a raw prototype of a mid-engined car that had a transversely mounted 8-cylinder engine, air-cooled, without showing any serious means of getting rid of the heat that this very powerful engine would generate. So, and they certainly didn't have the wherewithal, so I would say don't do that. Now, of course, the real history shows us this, and Chris Nixon shows in his book very well. There was a rival to Mercedes-Benz in the form of the Lancia D50, but I submit, and you can shoot me for that, Lancia was not really in a position to get into Grand Prix racing. They didn't have the financial wherewithal. Gianni Lancia, who was running the company then, should have been told to pivot more to the money-making side of the business and hold back for now on the passionate racing enterprise. So I don't think that was real. Also, although they had a car that, after some development, showed promise and could have challenged Mercedes. They could probably not withstand the ongoing upgrades and competition that would raise the bar. So my conclusion here is there was no single entity in Italy or elsewhere in France or England that could really mount a challenge to Mercedes-Benz, and therefore something else would have to happen in order to fulfill my dream of propelling forward the change to rear-engined cars. So I've defined two conditions that are necessary for enduring Grand Prix success. It probably pertains to other classes as well. An effective project has to have a solid funding and a long-term commitment. It can't just be a commitment. We heard that earlier about the advertising industry that may chip in. It has to be more than 1 year. It has to be an extended commitment from a potent industrial corporation, I would say. Doesn't necessarily have to be a car company, as Red Bull today demonstrates this, but it should preferably be one. And I would submit as a second condition, a component supplier should be involved also. And particularly since either tires or fuel are playing a big role in the ultimate performance of the car, maybe one of those suppliers should be involved actively, not just putting their labels on the car, but being actively involved in the development process, because they have some skin in the game financially, but also image-wise. And so when you have these two conditions fulfilled, I think then you have a good shot at being ultimately successful. And I bring forward two examples here for your consideration, although they extend a little bit beyond the time period I'm talking about. But there is the Fenwal effort to bring British racing green into the forefront of Grand Prix racing. And Tony van der Wel, who was very committed, who had the wherewithals, he was the head of a large corporation that built sliding bearings for engines for the car industry and some other things. Among other things, he owned Lucas, was responsible for the Prince of Darkness. And insofar, there was some potency there. And over years, first he started out with modified Ferraris, as you know. Then he pivoted towards his own design and was ultimately successful. In 1958, he won the first Constructors' Championship, which was then open for the first year. Not the Drivers' Championship that went to Mike Hawthorne on a Ferrari. And then you could say Rubery Owen, which also adopted the BRM project, which was kind of flawed from the get-go when it was this designed by committee organization way back in the 40s. But it was like a cat with many lives. It ended up at some point, once the automotive component company, Rubery Owen, pulled pretty much out of that venture. Then we find an example where a different type of sponsor comes into the picture. Marlboro, you see the Marlboro BRM as a part of a specimen here in the same image. And that would be one way, but that sponsorship was not really contributing to the technical development, and it was pretty feeble because they went from one car company to the next, and sometimes they supported more than one, but it wasn't enough to stay alive. So what I'm proposing, and again, this is a bit of a leap of faith that you may want to follow me with or not, I think in Italy there was enough potential, there was enough passion to get big time into Grand Prix racing, but it would take that financial underpinning of a larger company. We knew Fiat would not participate. They were never interested after their successes in the 1920s to go back into GP racing. So it takes a conglomerate, a firm, very similar to the Auto Union that we had seen prior to World War II. I suggest in Italy there should be the establishment of an Unione Automobili, a Finmeccanica company, part of the IRE, which was a public holding company in Italy that had picked up previously in the 1930s already Alfa Romeo when they were in hard times. And so Alfa Romeo was already part of this holding company. I submit, when you look at the categories here and the brands that Auto Union had, then Alfa Romeo probably would be an equivalent to Wanderer. The DKW, I'm struggling a little bit with it. I think ISO Rivolta, and the Isetta would be an interesting play. I think also since DKW always had motorcycles as the point of entry for consumers to get into mobile equipment, there may be a play for Vespa in terms of a joint venture, perhaps. Lancia would be the upscale part, not trying to compete with Alfa Romeo. That would be fairly senseless. There may be some overlapping, some platform sharing that I could see, even with the eyes of somebody in the early 1950s. There may be in this low-cost segment a play for Panhard out of France, but in those days having multinational corporations was probably not very feasible yet. So that's a bit of an open question. Maybe you've got better ideas for that. And I add also a category, and we'll soon see why that is significant. And I'm not really talking about mid-engined race cars, as you recognize. I'm building a platform that allows that technology to really take place in a big scale. I submit also tractors could play a role. And there is a play for the Same tractor company that also has a long history of being connected to Alfa Romeo, because the Cassani brothers that formed Same had previously formed Spica. Some of you may know they were the Italian equivalent of Bosch in fuel injection. And so these tractor guys, they needed for their diesel engines something to get the fuel into the combustion chambers. And since with the autarky policy, they couldn't just go to Bosch in Stuttgart and get their stuff. They built their own version. And they got then into IRE and were delegated into the Alfa Romeo fold in the 1930s, 1940s already, because it was seen that they were more relevant with their technology. Now, the people that were coming from the tractor faculty did not match very well to the more structured corporate environment, and they left pretty soon and formed their own tractor company again, which became very successful and exists still today, headquartered in Treviglio, Italy. So I put these elements together in some way, because so far there's perhaps a good story if you believe that this Unione Automobili could come into being. But of course, in every good story, there are heroes and there are villains. And I think a very obvious villain, kind of the white elephant in the room, is that one. Fiat would probably not sit still and say, oh, this is nice, there's a new competitor being formed, and public money goes into that also. So somehow Unione Automobili would have to create a competitive advantage that was compelling, particularly to the politicians of that time. Because Fiat had clout in the political space at the time, and had that for decades. So one of the things Fiat was not terribly interested in was helping to sustain or to develop the Mezzogiorno, the poorer, lower part of Italy, which was mostly an agrarian society with a lot of manual labor in agriculture. So that's where the slow development comes into play to gradually bring up the technical capabilities and financial wherewithals in southern Italy, rather than putting some of these huge projects into place as had been done and was done later on with steelworks and so on, that became cathedrals in the desert that didn't really fit into the society yet. So I submit that having a tractor, a very simple one, this was the first Summit tractor, later on they became much more sophisticated, it would help, you know, to transfer manual labor into mechanized forms of agriculture. It would free up labor, but you could also now bring some of the farm boys into mechanics, into working on vehicles on a very low level of complexity. And then later on you could grow that. So you could do something like Ford did when they had ramped up the Model T manufacturing. They established branch office assembly plants or branch assembly plants in different parts of the country. One is still there in building stands still there in Fargo, North Dakota. It's no longer used for its original purpose, obviously. It's a nicely converted office building. But they assembled parts that were shipped from Detroit to these remote areas and helped to reduce shipping costs, for one thing, because when you ship whole cars, you're shipping mostly air. They shipped some parts that came from the mothership, and then there was some local content gradually introduced. So when you do that, you have some more sustainable, gradual development of a more agrarian company. And frankly, people who come from the land, who see the progress that mechanization can bring, they will buy more into this, and they will later on become good mechanics and good people that can assemble more complex vehicles in the South. So also you are, or when you're an automobile, you can leverage state development funds that were available at the time. The Casa per il Mezzogiorno and the IMRRC Casa for public housing could have been dipped into, particularly if the political communication would have worked well. Now, what you need then for the leadership in this new company would be somebody who's more politically astute, not somebody who is an engineer and loves cars and digs deeply into it. It's probably not the right person who can convince some of the politicians and political powers in place, parties, that it's in their best interest longer term to support this program. And so you find a person in Luigi Rosari who has been a long-term leader within the Pirelli organization. He was responsible for the cable business in Pirelli, not so much for the tires. He was a person with a lot of soft skills. He had honed those during the transition when committees ruled these large corporations for a while in 1946. And so he had good experience in labor relations, which down the road would become invaluable. So he was very much about this gradual and sensible growth of the Mezzogiorno. So I take this, by the way, this is an image of the Fargo Ford assembly plant. It looks way too fancy for what it was made for. And so now we look at the industrial supplier, the component supplier, and we checked in a due diligence process out 4 companies, and the choice is pretty obvious. You know, there are companies that have technical know-how, like these folks that make frames for race cars. They're very specialized in that. They're very good at tubing and forming oval tubing and tapered tubing and so on. Gilco, Auto Telai, very good, but they also work for Ferrari and for Lancia and for whoever pays them. So you don't want to really get them too close to what you're doing with your new concept. Olivetti is certainly interesting from a technology perspective, because they were getting into digital computation at that time already, the typewriter folks. obviously. And so long-term, they may be interesting, but short-term, they were also a little bit of an utopian company. Pirelli, an obvious choice. Montecatini, a large chemical company, could play a role in that they wanted to get into the automotive industry, so they could leverage perhaps this entry point, and that may be good. But since we know that tires are so essential for the success of race cars, and Pirelli had a long-term success with their bias ply tires, conventional tires in racing. They won world championships up to that point, and they also developed a radial tire already since '49. So that kind of prompts me to think, why not introduce radial tires to racing, to Grand Prix racing, at this early point of entry? It would be doable, I think, and Pirelli would see benefits from doing that. It would become a centerpiece of their marketing campaign to show that radial tires can work under the most harsh and demanding conditions. They would have enough skin in the game in this project, because if they lose, that doesn't look good for them. But on the other hand, of course, these tires, compared to the previous ones, require a different driving style. So there is something to learn for the people that run these cars. In essence, the slip angle gets much smaller for a given lateral force. But Pirelli has the opportunity to become also Unione Automobili's preferred tire supplier. There's a volume business in the background. And this is a depiction, obviously, of the radial tire, the Cinturato. But we need a technical head. So we switch scenes here, and we go to Burton-on-Trent in the UK. You may ask, why do we do that? Well, there is an interesting person to be met, and that's, again, our friend Robert Eberhard-Eberhorst, who was involved in the Auto Union activities. He also oversaw the Cisitalia construction in Torino. And so he is being invited by the Pirelli UK office for a chat. At the time, he was in England. He worked as the chief engineer at Aston Martin, the company that was then owned by David Brown. He had been lured into England to work at ERA, but according to his own words, that proved to be a disaster, a real disappointment, because they didn't nearly have the resources that he was used to. At Aston Martin, it wasn't much better. So the leadership of Unione Automobili talks him into coming back to Italy instead, leave this misery in England behind, and don't get tempted by this new Auto Union, because that's what he will do in reality. He will find that the lower ranks in the company really don't like him, and even some of his peers on the upper echelon despise him, because he's a little bit too far out there for their taste. So I suggest this new scenario has Eberhard Eberhorst become the technical director and responsible for the GP project at Unione Automobili. And by doing that, we combine this analytical spirit, the scientific approach to race car engineering, with the passion of the Italians and with the willingness to experiment. The car concept is somewhat influenced by the Cisitalia 360. It's, although less complex, for example, I don't think the four-wheel drive solution was already appropriate, or may never be in such a car, and I would place the gearbox behind the differential, behind the rear axle, which would increase the polar moment of inertia in the yaw mode a bit and would make the car a little bit more drivable. The seating position would be more reclined than in the Cisitalia, which in a way was still old school, but it had already a good space frame, so we use that. We extend the cockpit so that the driver can lean back a little bit. it makes a lot of sense to use a V6 engine because Lancia and its fame was built around V6 engines. There were interesting engineers like the Virgilio who came up with the 60-degree equal firing order distance or angle V6, which at the time was not well known or was not practiced. But he introduced that successfully to Lancia, and there were other folks from the Lancia team that would have been useful. I submit, of course, the engine would have double overhead camshaft, and it would have a Spica fuel injection system. And you don't want to overfreight a new project with too many features that are new and unproven. So for exploratory purposes, they should dabble with pneumatic valve springs to have an alternative to the desmodromic valve train that Mercedes had introduced or would introduce. So the V6 with a volume of 2.5 liters, rated speed and piston speed in particular was well within the realm of possibilities of that time. So I'm not exaggerating too much. This would be a pretty competitive project. It would be a good chance to introduce disc brakes, preferably from Girling, that were readily available and somewhat proven. I think the anti-roll bar introduction to GP cars was long in coming and should be introduced here for sure. Then again, the exploration to future upgrades could be devoted to a monocoque chassis and, more importantly, to the introduction of aerodynamic downforce. So this is a very rough back of an envelope sketch of this Grand Prix car. In hindsight, it would look like something is nothing special. Again, why did it take so long? From today's perspective, it's easy to say. When you were living in 52 or 53, it was a little bit more of a stretch of imagination, but not totally uncalled for. John and Charles Cooper in England had been working on these kinds of concepts already, and Keynote had its own program going on. This is one of the pictures of their prototype. They were waiting for the Godiva Coventry Climax engine, the V8 engine, to become ready, and they would have put it into the back of their car, and it would have been a very interesting Challenger. But Coventry Climax got cold feet. They thought the engine wasn't powerful enough, and they heard of 300 horsepower plus that Mercedes would be delivering, which they never did. And so they decided to deep six their very impressive V8 engine program. So this is what the rough concept looked like. I don't want to get into much detail because that's left to the engineering team. Now, when you have so many unknown parts in your car, you want to de-risk your project. And here I introduce another player, Rudolf Ruska, who had been working with Swiss Italia, with Porsche. So he was part of the inner team already, and he would be tasked with providing a test mule. That would be a car that would not look like a Grand Prix car yet, but the underpinnings would be exactly that, and you could introduce new technologies gradually and expose the drivers to the new driving characteristics and working with disc brakes and radial tires in a very disguised way. You could do data acquisition and learn about the optimization of this new package. So he was a good player for doing that. He had good connections to the carrosserias. Touring had already worked for Montecatini, previously mentioned, on this little prototype with a resin fiberglass combination bodywork. And so we suggest they should just do something like this and use that as the test mule and run it in Monza and on other tracks. And Ruska will later on lead a project that will unify the platforms of the Giulietta Alfa Romeo and the Appia of Lancia to save costs, to get economies of scale, and this project should be successful. Now, we talk about advanced aerodynamics, and when we think of wings, we think that's something that happened very recently with Chaparral and Jim Hall, perhaps, or maybe Michael May in Switzerland in the mid-50s. But in the late 30s, when Mercedes wanted to build this T80 world record car, they had already experimented. This was, again, a design of the Porsche engineering firm. They had already dabbled with the thought of wings, fixed wings, even movable flaps here, and this is all discoverable in late open patent applications and patents that were accessible to people, certainly in the 1950s. So this fellow here, Josef Mickel, was a member, founding member of the Porsche engineering team in Stuttgart. His background was aeronautical and mechanical engineering, and he had a specific interest in the aerodynamics. So these patents are very interesting to read and very visionary. Okay, so I'm getting to the end, thank you, because we need also drivers, obviously, in order to make this a successful project. And here I propose that Alberto Ascari is undisputable the best choice to be driver number one. He was the world champion in 52, 53, and he left Ferrari not for Lancia as in real life, but here he comes to Unione Automobili and will be their star driver. He most likely will not have a splash in the Monaco harbor, and he'll have no reason to drive a sports car of Ferraris on May 26th, 1955, where he fatally crashes. And the second one, just briefly to round this out, we learn from the Rosemeyer experience and bring in somebody from the motorcycle faculty, a two-time world champion that was proven on 500cc motorcycles with Gilera. He won 2 titles, and so he would be an interesting addition to the team because he would bring a different driving experience with him, and analog to Bernd Rosemeyer, he may be able to deal with these rear-engined cars better, or mid-engined cars better than, say, drivers that were used to the conventional ones. Anyway, so at the end, the happy end is shown in these 2 bars here. Ascari will not win the 1954 World Championship. That would be too much of a stretch. We leave that to Fangio, but he's a close second. And Massetti happens to win one Grand Prix, the British one. That was a bit of an aberration with bad weather conditions, etc. So that's pretty much the framework of this story. It brings together the Italian element and some of the Germanic, which is mostly Austrian, to be honest. A lot of the good automotive engineers that work in Germany come from Austria or from former Czechoslovakia. That happened here too. So it's this combination that could accelerate the rear engine or mid-engine revolution. I give it to you to criticize that or tell me I'm totally out of mind. I've done a lot of research to get this put together. There's an underlying manuscript of 100 pages and with real sources, so this is not all just out of thin air. So it has some validity and maybe some believability. But I leave it up to you as the much more experienced folks.
Analysis and a very different approach to all this. History in action. Any quick questions? We're running a little behind right now. I want to get Mackenzie up here. Thank you. That was really great. Thank you. Our next presentation is a very interesting one, kind of ties into with some of the things we've talked about over the years, like with Buzz and some of the others we've talked about in NASCAR. Mackenzie Kirkey is going to talk to us about organized labor in NASCAR, the Teamsters, and the Federation of Professional Athletes. So, looking forward to this one. Okay.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mackenzie, and today we'll be talking about organized labor in NASCAR, the Teamsters, and the Federation of Professional Athletes.
Sorry, folks. Go ahead.
Yeah, can you hear me now? Okay, I'm going to move it up a little bit, or maybe too much up. Technology. So just as a little introduction to the... Now it doesn't want to switch. There we go. Got it. So the introduction, so the Teamsters in 1961, they were looking to expand their foothold in the American South, and NASCAR driver and promoter Curtis Turner offered them to do so. He offered the Teamsters that he would organize himself and his fellow NASCAR drivers under the Federation of Professional Athletes, or FPA, in exchange for a loan for paying out the outstanding debts to Charlotte Motor Speedway, a track that Turner had founded and been recently voted off as track president. The Teamsters saw this as a strategic opportunity, and it agreed to Turner's terms, but with the understanding that the union would have to be formally and publicly recognized by NASCAR as the driver's official representation. So what are some goals about the presentation? Well, to establish that Turner's main goal for even founding the FPA to begin with was to get himself reestablished as the president and principal officer of Charlotte Motor Speedway, to also present the reasons why the drivers who initially championed the FPA quickly abandoned it when confronted by NASCAR's founder, owner, and CEO Bill France Sr., and how he was able to successfully quash the union. Now one of the things that NASCAR, the founding of which has been really established, but as far as how the organization was run, this is the chief grief among the drivers. So how was it done so? Well, France privately owned the company. That was a management control system. Basically, France had say in everything that NASCAR had to do, whether it was regarding purses, driver points, schedule, etc. But one thing that he did was disqualify any driver that did not specify his rules book, and only his rule book, which he had sole control over. And this happened in 1949 with the first Grand National race, which we know today as the NASCAR Cup Series, when driver Glen was disqualified by France for having a illegal piece of wedge in his springs that helped the car turn better in the corners. Now, back then, there was no appeals board for NASCAR, so whatever France said was final, except Dunaway's owner, Hubert Westmore, decided to sue NASCAR for $10,000 to have Glen Dunaway reinstated as the race winner. The first true case of someone going up against Bill France and testing his authority. Well, early 1950, Judge Johnson J. Hayes sided with NASCAR, saying that France had the right to disqualify racers that did not fit the race car drivers that did not fit specifications according to the technical specifications of the rules book. A major victory for France in the sense that not only was his rule book legal precedent, but also his decision making as well. And as Buzz McKim had already went a little bit this morning, Bill France Sr., if he caught you racing in any other series besides his own, he would strip you of your driver points during the season. It happened to Curtis Turner, the aforementioned Lee Petty, and in 1950 happened to Red Byron twice, who the year had been the previous champion. But there's also one key legal case in 1951 that would be key not only for the start of the FPA, but ultimately its end. And this was a legal case of the Outdoor Sports Corporation. So in a 6-1 rule, the New Jersey Supreme Court had said that the drivers participating in the series were not employees of the series, but rather contestants or independent contractors. In short, the court establishes there's no employer-employee relationship in any racing series. So this is going to come, come 1961, this is going to be very important when it comes to the founding of the FPA and the latter stages of it. So skipping a little bit ahead to 1959, Curtis Turner decides he wants to build Charlotte Motor Speedway, a dream of his to own and operate his own speedway. He even got Bill France Sr. to sanction a bunch of NASCAR races starting in 1960, the most prominent being the World 600 on Memorial Day weekend, which today is known as the Coca-Cola 600. Well, unfortunately for Turner, construction problems hampered the track from the very beginning. First and foremost, the land that was being constructed on was under solid granite. Construction costs went through the roof overnight. It also did not help efforts that over 3 feet of precipitation fell in the fall and winter of 1959-1960 alone. Despite enacting 12-hour workdays for the construction workers, the track could not have the race ready for May of 1960. It got pushed back 3 weeks, in large part because half the track wasn't even fully paved yet. That's how bad the construction problems turned out to be. So, and they only got it done, the paving job, within about a day or two of the race actually ready to go. So how did the World 600 turn out in 1960? It was a complete disaster. That's right, you're seeing Lee Petty and Bobby Jones' cars respectively with windshield and grille coverings made out of chicken wire. Now, why did they have to go to this extreme? It's a little hard to see here, but there's potholes. The track themselves, the fact is if you don't let the pavement harden, it's going to create the potholes, and the problem was the chunks of asphalt were going so bad that they threatened to go through the windshields of the drivers themselves and even the grills of the cars that would pretty much kill the motor. The race itself was an absolute disaster for Turner. Out of the 60 drivers that started the race, only 18 finished. It did not help things that Bill Francine disqualified Lee Petty, Richard Petty, and Junior Johnson for what he called illegal pit entry and stripped all their prize money. In short, things could not have turned out worse for Curtis Turner. And the track floundered with attendance and upkeep costs like the unforeseen repaving the track and even payroll costs. So by the time we get to June of 1961, the Charlotte Motor Speedway was at a crossroads. It's facing over $800,000 in debt. And the track board is given an ultimatum. Remove Curtis Turner immediately from all positions, whether it's the board, the presidency, or the track will be foreclosed on. So that's exactly what happens. And now Turner, in his mind, after being forced to resign as president and bloated off the board of directors, has one goal in mind: regain control of the track in any way he could. And he only saw one way to do so: get the debts paid off that the track owed. And this is where the Teamsters Union comes in. So ironically, before Turner was even ousted, his chief financial officer, William Rabin, had offered him a meeting with the vice president of the Teamsters Union, Harold Gibbons, to talk about the problems of the track, to see if he'd be interested in getting a loan in exchange for unionizing himself and his fellow drivers. Well, Turner was just too proud of a guy to do so. So he rejected it, thinking that he alone could solve the track debt's problems. So what ended up happening was Turner at this point realized, I need to go see the Teamsters again, see if the offer still stands. And it did. So Curtis Turner, along with his fellow driver Glen Fireball Roberts, one of the most respected drivers of the early NASCAR days, decided to go to Chicago to meet with the Teamsters, and in early August hammered out the agreement for an $850,000 loan for unionizing as many NASCAR drivers as possible, and with the understanding that this would have to be formally and publicly recognized by NASCAR as their representation. So once the meeting is done, Turner quickly goes to Bowman Gray Stadium on August 5th to talk to his drivers to see if they'd be interested in. And surprisingly, there were quite a few. Now, why did the drivers was so interested in the FPA? Well, they saw a few reasons. One, they saw the pay scale wasn't right. They thought that the pay themselves that they were getting, the rice purses, were more like the late 40s, early 50s standards. I think by the time you get to 1961, NASCAR has a longer schedule, more diverse races, higher paying races, and they would get fans not only for the races themselves, but for practicing and qualifying as well. So the tracks would make more money, and the drivers didn't see that trickling down to themselves. Also, once you retire from NASCAR, there was no retirement system. You had no pension, you had no benefits. But above all, the drivers saw one thing. They saw Bill France having all decision-making in any NASCAR decisions, and they had no say. And they saw this union as a potential for them to finally get in voice of NASCAR's decision-making. So once they're doing that right under Bill France Sr., do you think he's going to just let it go? Of course not, he doesn't. So first thing he does on August 6th through the 7th is call his fellow track owners and promoters to see if not only they would be behind him, but behind him for one particular reason: a ban. France wanted to ban any FPA driver competing at any of his races at any of the tracks, and wanted to make sure the tracks themselves would enforce this ban by escorting any drivers from the property and seizing the NASCAR licenses if it came to that. But he also wanted to do one other thing, go to Washington, D.C. Now, in early 1961, who's the one guy you want to see in Washington, D.C. if you have a Teamsters Jimmy Hoffa problem? Specifically, someone who's confronted Hoffa, maybe in the televised, not so much debates, but grillings. That's right, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy. And does France have an appointment to go see him? Of course he doesn't. It's Bill France. So it goes right to his office, and, well, France can't see him at the moment. So he sends him to one of his special assistants, John Cassidy, one of the special assistants to the Attorney General. But before he does, France calls Cassidy and lets him know what's going on. Tells him who France is, what his organization is, and tells him Jimmy Hoffa and the Teamsters are trying to take it over. We cannot let that happen. I'm sending him to your office. Do what you need to do to help him. But also, before France left Washington, he wanted to check one important thing. The 1951 Supreme Court case by the state of New Jersey was still legal precedent, that the drivers themselves were not employees of a racing series, but rather contestants or independent contractors. And he got that reassurance. With all that said, on August 9th, Bill France leaves Washington, D.C., and goes right to Bowman Gray Stadium the next race on the schedule. Well, on the way down, it did not help things that the Teamsters had publicly proclaimed in the Charlotte Observer that they had taken over NASCAR by signing up the majority of drivers. That did not help Bill France feel any better. So Bill France, before the race, quickly meets with the drivers and lets it know, any driver after tonight's race that's an FPA member will be banned from NASCAR for life. Yes, he had a gun. Yes, he showed it and threatened them, but he also reminded them a few things. Any support you would get from Detroit will be taken away if you stay with the union. Anything in that regard. Also, if you have any workers like a mechanic, now you're going to have to pay them overtime. Time and a half on Saturday, double time on Sunday. And he offered the drivers to sign these cards. Renounce your union membership. Pledge your loyalty to NASCAR. No worries, I'll even do something that's going to really make you happy. I'm going to offer you a committee. Ned Jarrett, you can lead it. And we're going to seek to improvements in NASCAR. If you have any grievances against me or any questions, any concerns, go to this committee. But the question is, after all that's done, did it convince the drivers to change their mind? Well, it did. And why did the drivers abandon this union so quickly? Well, France had offered to address their main grievance. Have a grievance committee, listen to all the complaints and whatnot, and maybe have a say in NASCAR decision making. But by the time you get to early 1961, NASCAR was no longer a hobby for these drivers. NASCAR at this point, with an extended schedule of high-paying races, drivers did not work in the mills Monday through Friday and go race on the weekends. NASCAR was their livelihood, a way that they made a living for their families. That's the way that NASCAR was to them. And also, we have to remember, Bill France had monopoly in Southern Star car racing. You just couldn't go to any other series, make the same amount of money, make a living for your family. France had control if whether he owned the racetracks or sanctioned races with other track promoters who were behind him. Remember, the reason track promoters were behind him too is these are the big races they get every year. This is where the most money is made for the attendance, for everything, for gate receipts. The drivers had nowhere else to race. And we cannot forget about the perception of the Teamsters Union itself. Not just between Jimmy Hoffa and Robert Kennedy, but also the perception of the Teamsters Union, or as Bill France liked to call them, gangsters, or thugs, or corrupt, or anything like that. So, the good news for Courage Turner is he still has Fireball Roberts, who was the FPA president. But 2 days after France met with the drivers, Roberts surprises everyone and renounces his union membership. He resigns as president. And of course, Bill France welcomes him back right away. Now, Roberts was asked, why? Why did you abruptly resign your membership? And it goes back to the very last point, the perception of the Teamsters. He sees the Teamsters Union doing more harm than good when it came to NASCAR racing in itself. So, what does Courage Turner think the next move is? Well, I still got Tim Flock. Let's see if France really is going to enforce this ban. You know, he's just all talk. He's not going to do anything. Let's go to a modified race, one of the lower divisions in NASCAR in Roanoke, Virginia. Is he really going to do anything? Well, track officials are waiting for him. As soon as Turner and Flock get there, they're confronted. They have their NASCAR licenses seized. They are banned from the track. Just a couple days later, on the 13th of August, the next Grand National race, or Cup race, is held in Nashville with not a single FPA driver racing, just what Bill France said would happen. So at this point, Turner only sees he only has one card left in his deck, and that is to sue Bill France and NASCAR to be reinstated. And this happens in September 1961. Well, NASCAR simply brings up the legal precedent of the 1951 case. And before you know it, early 1962, Circuit Court Judge Robert Winfield agrees and tosses the lawsuit out of court, and Turner and Tim Flock are banned, at least for the time being. But the question we haven't talked about the Teamsters, why didn't the Teamsters try harder to save the union or get more involved? Well, they had a lot of other problems going on with them. First and foremost, in Cincinnati, in late August of 1961, they have 4 of their own branches trying to defect to the AFL-CIO. And not just there, but in St. Louis and San Francisco and elsewhere around the country. Jimmy Hoffa did not want to let that happen. He personally flew to these places to make sure that he would convince them to stay, or maybe in his words, remind them who's boss. So, with that being in mind too, but also the Teamsters realized the union itself was not worth saving. You had gone from maybe about 10 to 12 drivers on the August 5th to down to 2 drivers. You had really, and it was one of the rules that they had violated. Curtis Turner, before suing NASCAR, had abandoned all union membership in the sense of trying to recruit efforts. Nothing like that was done. That was one of the other things. And then at the end, the Teamsters realized they had violated one of the very simple rules of the Hart-Taftly Act, Section 302. You cannot offer a person or a group of people, in this case Turner and Roberts, a loan in exchange for forming a union that you would be affiliated with. It's against the law. So they realized after they had sued NASCAR that this was not going to work. And that's why the Teamsters themselves did not get more involved, between having problems with their own union members and the fact they realized this lawsuit was not going to work. So, in conclusion, of course, with the FPA failing, Curtis Turner never regained control of Charlotte Motor Speedway. An ironic twist of fate, Bill France maintained full control and power of NASCAR because the committee he had set up. He didn't really set it up to, actually do anything. He made sure that he picked Ned Jarrett, someone who was, as they nicknamed Gentleman Ned, someone who would, is respected but wouldn't be like Curtis Turner. He wouldn't form his own drivers' union or race a fuss. He would just be told what to do, and simple as that. So as Ned Jarrett said, the committee met for a couple of years and then quietly dissolved. France had quashed the union and had gained full control and say of NASCAR decision-making. And the Teamsters themselves, unfortunately for their decision not to fully support the union, focus on more important things, which might have been the good point at the time, led to its demise. In fact, the Teamsters are so embarrassed by this that when I did my research at the Teamsters archives in Washington, D.C., I could not find anything on this. And I asked the person who was the archivist, why is this the case? Why is there no documentation? He said, well, since this was such a failure and a bit of a small black eye on the Teamsters, any documentation they had at the time was destroyed. They wanted this erased from memory. That's how bad it was for them. Thank you, everyone.
That was a very good explanation, one of the better ones I've heard. Nothing against you, Buzz, but that was really good, to the point. We're going to take some questions right now. Hang on.
I was on the board of International Speedway Corporation from 1980 to about 10 years. John Cassidy was their go-to Washington attorney, even in those days. So he had a long tenure working with the France family after he left and went into private practice.
Just as a follow-up, Did you ever look at 1977, Jeff Bodine and Jack Housby and their efforts to get Teamsters as a sponsor?
No.
Okay, you ought to look into that one too. It's pretty interesting.
Any news about what ever happened to Jimmy Hoffa?
I was hoping you'd ask. Now, as a Martin Scorsese fan, with the movie The Irishman, I have to believe that you cannot find the body of Jimmy Hoffa. If the movie is correct, and I believe it is, there is no body. He was whacked, and then they pretty much incinerated him, turned him into ashes, so I don't think you're going to find a body.
Bob? Okay, here comes a sad part, really, that we have to bring this whole thing to an end. I hate these things because there's always somebody that gets left off the recognition who truly deserves it. I want to give, Eric, where are you? Eric and Bob have, for 2 years in a row, put this whole magic thing together. And where's Colin? There he is. These guys deserve a big hand. This is our second shot at it, and these three have done magic. I cannot thank them enough for this. The support from Glen Touring Motorsports, from WGI, and of course Bob from the Society of Automotive Historians. They have worked hard, planned, and made this all happen. It's all magic, and they truly made it happen. Bob, you have a couple of people you want to recognize.
They hit it home already, but the two ladies that were sitting in the back table, Brenda Neville, who's kind of the office manager at the IMRRC, and Samantha Baker, or Sam as we call her, she did the layout on this. It's all her work. She was the lady with the glasses. And Conlon, thank you for your help today. Everything went lickety-split. You were right there. If we texted him, he just appeared out of nowhere. And Eric did the work here. I'm just running around trying to keep up with him. It went a lot better than last year, and we promise next year will go a lot better than this year in terms of the staging. We've already got some ideas. So thank you all for coming. Thank you.
I want to thank Rob Dyson for coming and giving the speech. The Jing Argetsinger Memorial address means a lot. Means a lot. We started this off basically as the Gene S. Argetsinger Symposium. The family asked that it be the Mike Argetsinger. But if you listen closely, we call it the Argetsinger now. The support from the family. I'm going to point, Duke, stand up. Duke is, in the Army we call him an S4 or the G4 according to level. He's a logistics person. He's the person who does all the nudge work, keeps things rolling, makes the planning, makes it happen. He has done this now for a number of years, and that has made life so much easier. All I have to do is just pull together a bunch of academics and hobbyist historians and smart people and try to get them here. He's got to make sure that meals get here, the programs are printed, this happens and that happens. That is the recognition for the rest of the people. Mark Starkewald and all the staff that work so hard. Bill Green has been a historian of the Research Center from the start. Bill, stand up. Bill is a dear friend for years now, decades, and he's a dear friend of all of us because, as Rob found out, please get it right. It's a town road, not a county road. I've been down that road. I've been on the same path. I understand. So, but a couple of other people that really need organization. The Watkins Glen area Chamber of Commerce and the Schuyler County Chamber of Commerce have been very supportive over the years. It started off with the Center Conversations and is now evolved into this. This was a mission that I think Jing Argetsinger had in mind years ago. And I think as some of you who have dealt with Miss Jean, once Jean got a hold of you, resistance was futile. It was all over. I would say within 15 seconds after she got her hands on me, it was all over. I was part of this whole thing. And I'm the, I guess, the chair of the Historians Council and have been for a number of years. And we are so happy that this is now really moving in the direction we want it. Those of you who donate, who are the members of the IMRRC, you make this happen. Your dollars, all that makes this possible. The generosity of Watkins Glen International, can't thank them enough. When they allowed us to use this facility, it was dynamite. It was dynamite. It was this little spark. All of a sudden, things just fell into place. We cannot thank them enough for this. Cannot thank, well, we have a member of the governing council here right now. Please stand up, Phil. Come on, come on. Stand up. We get the support from them. We appreciate what you on the governing council have been standing up for us year after year. We appreciate that. The president of the governing council, John Saunders, was one of the original co-conspirators of this whole research center. And so he's in it. He supports us. I know I'm going to leave a lot of people out when I say this, but the support staff, which Bob has mentioned, that we can't do things without Brenda, Neville, there's Josh, there's, the volunteers that come in and help. All this comes together. Mark runs it. Mark was here for, what, 10 years? Something like that. Left, and we got him back. And I was so delighted to have that. Okay. You have something? Oh, okay. I'm going to let you in. But seriously, we started off small. You've probably heard me say this. We started off with 3 Canadians. Dr. Doug Layton out of the University of Toronto. We had David Charters, Dr. David Charters out of University of New Brunswick. David I knew as another fellow military historian. And then we had people who had conflicts. I won't mention Markel by name, or John Heitman, or some of the other people that, but there were legitimate issues because we were holding it in October. That's a bad time for academics. But out of the sky, as I've told you before, they parted, and from Ave Maria University, a graduate from the University of Toronto, and a fellow Maple Leafs fan. I'm sorry for you Sabres people, but I'm sorry, I have to say that. Paul Baxa. So we had 3 people. Otherwise, it had been Pat Young or I giving a presentation. It has grown, and it has grown, and it has grown because of you. All the presentations we've had over the years have just been great. We have McPherson, we've got Alfred State has been here a number of times now. We now have Belmont Abbey in it. We've got, Mike Stoltz is now has come on board to do things, on and on and on. The people who work the SCCA archives, there's Joe and Rick has already left, they contribute because that's another asset of the research center that gets overlooked. That's coming online sometime in the future. What they have done, when I first saw it show up in a semi-trailer, this big thing, and it was all the stuff. How they have got it organized now is amazing. But the Society of Automotive Historians has taken this to heart. It's been a little slow, but they have embraced it. It didn't hurt that I was the president and we beat them up on it. But it has really been great to have all of you here. I can't thank you enough personally. I will always think every time I come here about Mike Argetsinger. This is something that Mike and I kicked around, couldn't quite figure out, get the support and whatever. And we had all kinds of plans. This was something that Gene and Mike really, really believed in. And it's been a dream come true for me and a number of other people. So hang on a second. I'm going to start crying a minute.
We had a special spin to this year, the books we had for sale. Those were compliments of Joe Freeman, Racemaker Press. He gave the IMRRC all those books free of charge. Earlier this week, SAH member Robert Signum of New York City drove down to the Boston area, picked up the books, and delivered them to the center. And we thank you all for buying so many of them. That's 100% into the treasury of the IMRRC. This man right here will start on the next, you are on next year, aren't you? He will start on the 2024, probably in January, and then my email will start filling up again. What do you want to bet, 300, 400 emails between us? Easily. He does all the scheduling. This schedule you see is put together by Duke, and he massages things around and talks to people. And any of you that were speakers, you saw all the emails you got from him. And when you see the email address symposium@racingarchives.org, that's actually Duke. That's his second email. So the bulk of all the arrangements and the behind-the-scenes stuff that starts in January and ramps up, and your proposals are submitted and dispersed to the committee that reviews them and evaluates them. It all goes through Duke. I'm kind of his second fiddle. So this will all start up again here in a couple of months. But thank you, Duke. We'd be dead in the water without you.
Anyway, this is, we keep getting bigger and better. 2015 when we started off small, and if you were here yesterday, the room was full. We have a big turnout today. I think the presentations were excellent. There were some great presentations to give you food for thought. I'm glad to see some excellent young people doing the presentations who are here. I'm glad to see a lot of familiar faces coming back into continuing that relationship. Basically all I can say is I want to see everybody, if at all possible, back here next year. Same bad time, same bad channel. So thank you very much, everybody. We appreciate it.